Unit 1, Cognitive Psychology. Presentation 1, The Nature of Memory, Encoding.
What have research studies shown us about the encoding of both short and long-term memories? The term encoding means putting something into code. In the case of memory, information is stored in various forms, such as visual codes, like a picture, acoustic codes, in other words, sounds, or a semantic code, which is the meaning of a word or experience.
The classic piece of research on this topic was conducted by Alan Baddeley in the 1960s. He gave participants various word lists to be recalled later. Some of the lists had words that sounded similar, for example, man, cat, cab, can. Some of the lists had words that sounded dissimilar, such as pit, few, and cow. Another list had words that had the same meaning, such as great, large, and big. And finally, there was a word list with words that had different meanings, for example, good, huge, and hot.
So, if we want to be precise, we should say the lists were acoustically similar or dissimilar, or semantically similar or dissimilar.
After seeing the lists, the participants were shown all the words in the list, and then were asked to recall the words in the correct order. If participants were asked to recall their word list immediately after hearing it, they tended to do worst with acoustically similar words, such as cat, cab, can, perhaps remembering cab was the first word, when it was in fact cat. This suggests that information is encoded acoustically in short-term memory. On the other hand, if participants were asked to recall the word lists after a time interval of 20 minutes, they did worst with the semantically dissimilar words. For example, they remembered that large was the first word, whereas in fact the first word was great. This suggests that longer-term memory is encoded in terms of meaning, in other words, semantically.
And what are the criticisms of this research?
Again, it's a lab study using quite artificial stimuli rather than meaningful material, so we might be wary about generalising the findings to different kinds of memory task. We might also note that 20 minutes is not very long term, so it is questionable whether the conclusions do apply to long-term memory.
Perhaps more importantly, subsequent research has pointed out exceptions to this rule that short-term memory is encoded acoustically, whereas long-term memory is encoded semantically. For example, Brandemote produced evidence that short-term memories are sometimes visually encoded instead of acoustically encoded. In Brandemote's study, participants were given a picture, which is a visual task. There was then a gap of time during which they had to say la 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 la. This was done to prevent any verbal rehearsal in the retention interval. At the end, they were then given a visual recall task. Normally, we translate visual images into verbal codes in short-term memory, but since verbal rehearsal was prevented, they used visual codes. This shows that encoding in short-term memory is not always acoustic. And Frost found something similar when studying long-term memory. He found that recall could be related to visual as well as semantic categories.